for Climate, Why We Must Stop Electric Cars from Destroying the World. We have three really amazing panelists joining us today, all co-founders of the Center for Interdisciplinary Climate Justice, CIEJ. We have Dr. Amrah Salomon, we have Dr. Leslie Quintanilla, and Dr. Jessica Ng joining us today. Before we begin, it's important to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway, Conoy, and Susquehannock people's land. Over time, citizens of many more Indigenous nations have come to reside in the region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future Indigenous people connected to this place, and we recognize that all land ultimately is Indigenous land. We would like to thank our sponsors for today, the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems, the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, the Department of Modern Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communications, the Global Studies Program, Women Involved in Learning and Leadership Program, and the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association. A special thanks goes out to Farsana Islam and Courtney Hobson, who have helped with all of the organizing, and a special thank you to my co-hosts today, to Yolanda, Valerie, and to Carla. Thank you. Just some reminders, as you can see, you have, there's a Q&A function. So throughout today's presentation, feel free to comment or post questions throughout the presentation. We will have time at the end for a Q&A portion of the presentation. And just to note, as Yolanda mentioned, the event is being recorded and is going to be available through the Drescher Center YouTube channel if folks are interested in the future. We'll start off with introductions, and I'll hand it over to Valerie.
Thanks so much, Maria, and thank you to all the panelists that are joining us today. Dr. Amrah Salomon J is a writer, artist, activist, and assistant professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is a former University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow and Ford Foundation Dissertation Fellow. Amrah also is a co-founder of Res Beats, a reservation-based Indigenous youth performance space, and a member of the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice, CIEJ. Her work has been published in both academic and literary publications in the United States, the UK, and in Mexico.
We would also like to introduce Leslie Quintanilla. Dr. Leslie Quintanilla is an organizer, artist, and currently an assistant professor of women and gender studies at the San Francisco State University. Her research focuses on contemporary issues related to borderland activism, including women of color, feminist artivism, environmental justice and climate change activism, and cross-diasporic solidarities. She's the co-founder for the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice, CIEJ, currently working alongside Indigenous communities in South America and in the US Southwest who are fighting against lithium mining.
And finally, to round out our panel, we are joined by Jessica Ng, who is a writer, artist, and PhD candidate at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a member of the Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice. She is committed to building solidarity with frontline communities facing green extractivism and creating many climate futures. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and let's get started.
Thank you. So now, Yolanda, if you can make Leslie presenter, and then we can get started. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Okay, Leslie, you should be ready now to present.
Okay, thank you all so much for those generous introductions. And I just want to make sure that my slides are being shown. Are they being shown? Great. So thank you, everyone. I'll start us off on behalf of the three of us by saying thank you to Maria Sayeri for inviting us and for organizing and for all the folks behind the scenes, doing all the paperwork, all the emails. We know it takes a lot of effort to put on events, even when we're still in a pandemic, and that the fact that this is an ongoing crisis is really important for us to say. So thank you all for your labor. and for your care in bringing this topic into this space, and to your students and to everyone who's listening. Thank you so much for logging in for whatever reason, right? For your classes or because you actually care about this conversation. Thank you so much. So the title of our presentation is Decolonize4Climate, which is a current campaign that our center is partaking and working in, and the conversation around why we must actually stop electric vehicles from destroying the world is kind of the main conversation that we want to lead folks into. Here we have a picture of a protest sign from Argentina that says, "Nosotros no comemos baterías, se llevan el agua, se llevan la vida," which means we don't eat batteries. If they take the water, they take life. So that's going to be the premise from which we are working alongside many land and water defenders right now across the world who are currently fighting for life against death-making structures of oppression, of land destruction, of water destruction. So we want to start off by saying that we are honoring those folks that are currently and have been disappeared because of the defense of life and water is a threat to a lot of governments, to a lot of powers. And we want to say that this is the work that we hope all of you are hoping to join as well, because it is the fight for life. We want to say that we're also coming from different locations. I'm currently on Ohlone territory in what is so-called California, Oakland. Amrah and Jessica are coming in from Kumi Islands in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. And we want to say that we are also not big believers in empty performative gestures of land acknowledgements, but we are instead believing that we can take direct action, that we are engaging in critical research and in critical coalition building so that we can support Indigenous decolonization, so that we can restore sacred relationships with the non-human world. So we want to say thank you to all of you who are working on Piscataway and Susquehanna people's lands, and hoping that we can create relations across our geographies. And given that one of the folks that we do look up to in terms of the work that has been done to defend water and to defend land and to defend life is by honoring the life of Berta Cáceres, who 7 years ago was murdered because of her defense of life and land. And she was an Indigenous Lenca woman who was one of the most prominent environmental and Indigenous rights activists in Honduras and Central America, who had been defending her territory against hydroelectric damming on Indigenous lands. And so we're thinking about the ways that, many technologies like electric damming or solar panels or electric vehicles require such enormous extraction of natural resources, and in particular minerals and metals, that they continue to pollute, they continue to destroy, they continue to pillage Indigenous lands and waters. And this is the premise through which we want to have a climate movement check-in with all of you about where we are currently at with the calls for energy transitions, the calls for just transitions, the calls for renewable or green energies, so-called green energies. And we know that it's basically impossible to give a comprehensive overview of the history of climate change or the intricate embeddedness of racial capitalism, colonialism, and all of these different ways that they co-produce environmental degradation. But we want to start from the base hope that we want to build intersectional and transnational decolonial, anti-colonial strategies for climate solutions that don't perpetuate death or destruction. So we want to have this movement check-in of sorts to really be aware and be vigilant of dangerous pitfalls that are surrounding Green New Deal frameworks, that are surrounding climate action plans in the United States, and in particular, the very real tensions around so-called zero carbon energy demands and new transportation demands, such as electric vehicles. And so I do want to make sure that we understand that a lot of the climate justice frameworks have been heavily reliant on our understanding and our acceptance that renewable energy equals technological fixes. And those are the main kind of concerns that we are having when thinking about climate action plans around the US and in different cities, especially metropolitan areas that are switching from fossil fuel energy, which we should, we should not continue to extract all these really destructive fossil fuel energies, but we also have to be vigilant about the electrification technologies currently taking shape. So we are currently under the very great cultural shift to kind of accept Teslas and electric vehicles as climate solutions for clean air. We're also under the very immense pressure to shift towards electric transportation more generally, such as public buses that are seen as, a public good. And we're also seeing the shift into very massive transitions to solar panels, including in homes and apartments. And again, while they have been framed as climate goods, I want us, as CIEJ to really be in conversation with everyone else around what does it actually mean to produce these technologies in terms of the supply chain and in terms of the extraction of minerals and metals that require these technologies to be produced, and what is it actually doing in terms of CO2 emissions? What is it actually doing in terms of the lands and the waters that are getting affected by the extraction of these metals and minerals for the purpose of whose clean air and on the backs of whose destroyed lands? And here it's very important for us to understand that electrification is only made possible because of extraction. And extraction is a very violent, a very destructive, and a very capitalist colonial way of understanding energy consumption and a way of structuring energy consumption in a globalized capitalist society. So we see right now a very heavy push on behalf of the US government, on behalf of this, very settler colonial capitalist US government, that a lot of cities are transitioning to a mass adoption of electric cars. We are seeing right now many different cities kind of use lands to produce new grids, to produce new storage facilities for these energies. And we have to be vigilant around what is it actually then doing to the ecosystem to produce these types of massive energy consumption facilities that are just shifting the problem from one energy to another. And so we want to understand that right now with Biden's clean energy push for electrification technologies, again, vehicles is just one, but there's many others, that there will be and already are communities, especially indigenous communities, whose lands and waters and cultures are in danger of being genocided and ecocided out of existence because of the minerals and metals that are needed to produce these energy technologies. And so we're very scared for what that means for the communities that are currently in relationship to our current campaigns and in our current relationship building process across the world. And one of the ways that we have seen the tension arise even further in terms of the shift is through culture, is through the discourse that is being spread through the media, through policy, through even environmental justice and climate justice organizations that use electrification as one of the so-called solutions to climate change. For us to think about where are the ways that in our everyday life this discourse is being imposed is an important question for all of us to think about and to reflect. And here's just one of the ways that we've noticed, at least here in California on this side of Turtle Island, is through many different campaigns to get individual consumers to shift to climate energy awareness by buying electric vehicles. And so here's just one campaign called Electric for All, where electric vehicles, so it doesn't have to be a Tesla, it could be an Audi, it could be other brands, that are now being made accessible and affordable to different communities, including BIPOC communities, including low-income communities, so that we can understand, according to them, that everyone can be a part of the solution to climate change through buying electric vehicles. And we see this as a problem. We see this as a big problem to the ways that we understand climate change narratives through so-called zero emission or green technologies, and really thinking about how these discourses in terms of companies, in terms of science even, or which science is being normalized through hegemonic notions of culture, music, and art. And so we want folks to be very vigilant around these greenwashing tactics that are happening in our music and in our ads, in our culture, in our everyday life, because there are very real material consequences by and via colonial capitalist extractivism. And the ways that specifically in terms of CIEJ, we are looking at lithium as one of the minerals that is being extracted for electric car batteries. It is one of just the many ways that we can understand greenwashing as a current tactic that we have to be very careful about not reproducing systems of oppression that are, again, ecociding many communities out of existence. So we want folks to be aware of false climate change solutions. Electric vehicles, solar panels, energy storage systems that are being touted as zero emission are part of the false climate solution narratives. And so a way for us to combat that, we're really thinking about understanding what can a decolonial feminist science as a process, as a praxis, as a material way of building relationships, what can that look like in terms of our research practices, where we're not necessarily using science to continue to destroy Indigenous lands and waters, but instead, how can science, how can research, how can activism, how can organizing be used in the service of creating life instead? And so today, I think it's important for us to really have a check-in around the many different movements that have allowed us to understand how can coalition building be a part of really having a critical lens on continuous destruction of land and life. So we understand, that the Dakota Access Pipeline and the folks that went over there in North Dakota to fight for the water is one of the many different ways that we can look towards not reproducing those same violent dynamics with the land and with the water. And when we see that there's these black pipes and these black snakes, really violently interacting and destroying lands, they're not just for fossil fuels, but they're also for lithium. They're also for nickel. They're also for copper. They're also there to extract these new minerals and metals. And so we have to be vigilant around the ways that these discourses are being sold to us. And I think we will start by understanding, what does extraction look like? What is extractivism in its material process, and what makes it so violent, and what makes it so destructive, and what makes it something that we have to be very cognizant about. So I'm going to pass it over to Jessica Ng, who's an earth scientist, and will let us know more about what that looks like. Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie, for that grounding and that framing, and calling us all into this space to think about these technologies more critically. So I'm going to walk through kind of an overview of lithium mining 101 and go through different types of lithium, how they're mined. It's going to be kind of a lot of information, so don't worry too much about the details. And if there is anything that you're more curious about, feel free to ask it in the chat or in the question section later. So lithium is found naturally on Earth in a few different forms. It's found in certain rocks as a mineral called spodumene. It's found in some clays, which are a type of very fine soil material. And it's also found in brines, which are super salty waters. In some places, like very dry deserts, where and we'll look into the details of all of these in a minute. So, great, thank you. Up until now, mining companies have done hard rock mining and brine evaporation. So we'll start with hard rock mining. It's what you might think of as kind of traditional mining, where you basically dig up rocks that have lithium in it, and leave a big open pit in the ground. And then to get the lithium out of the rock, they crush it and wash it with acid, and that makes the lithium come out of the rock and into solution. And so in the end, you've disturbed the ecosystem that was living on the ground surface, where there's now a big open pit. And then you've got this leftover crushed acid washed rock that you have to put somewhere, that becomes potentially toxic tailings. So the second version of mining that is currently done is brine evaporation. This is where this is done, if we can go to the next slide, mostly in the so-called Lithium Triangle, which covers the desert of the high Andes across Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And the really unique geography, geology, and climate of this area has created this lithium-rich brine over many thousands of years. It includes up to 75% of the world's lithium, which is how it gets its name. So this is the driest non-polar desert in the world. And any water that does collect here and arrive here collects in mountain basins. So these are low-lying areas between mountain ranges instead of draining out to the sea. And so you can kind of see here, rain falling on the mountains, it's flowing into this low-lying basin. It's entering the underground system and collecting in these aquifers. And then over many thousands of years, the water flows into the basin, bringing the minerals dissolved from the surrounding rock with it, accumulating underground, and also the intense dryness of the desert and the intense sunlight is evaporating the water and making those minerals become very concentrated. And so lithium, is, along with other minerals like potassium and other ones, get very concentrated. And so the ecosystem here is adapted to survive in these extreme conditions. It includes some unique extremophile bacteria that can live in this really, really salty water. And other forms of life that interact with these extreme organisms. There's even stromatolites, which are analogs of some of the earliest forms of life on Earth that originally produced oxygen in our atmosphere. And that the people who are indigenous to this area, the Lekanantai people, understand as their ancestors. And so, draining the water that goes into these salt lakes with the oxygen producing algae and stromatolites is destroying the home of their grandparents. So lithium mining in this setting is quite literally groundwater mining. So what the companies do is they pump water from these deep aquifers underground up to the surface into shallow pools, like you can see in the picture, where the brine becomes more evaporated by the sun and the dryness of the desert. And so when the water leaves, the minerals come out of the brine so that they can be collected and chemically processed into battery components. And so for a sense of scale of how much water this takes, one Olympic-sized swimming pool of non-renewable groundwater contains enough lithium to create 23 Tesla cars. And Tesla's goal is to be producing 20 million cars by the year 2030, which is approaching a lot faster than expected, and is a lot of water. So those are the two methods that are currently being used: hard rock mining and brine evaporation. But as lithium demand is expected to be much greater than what's currently being mined, there are even more new methods to extract lithium that are being developed. And so companies are going after clay deposits, which are more difficult to get lithium out of than the sort of traditional rock deposits. but would be mined in kind of a similar way with similar impacts. So if we go to the next slide, to walk through it briefly again, you've got your mine, next slide, your open pit mine that's digging clay out of the earth. Next slide, you add sulfuric acid to the clay to get the lithium out, and some of these projects that are being proposed include actually producing the sulfuric acid like locally, which is sort of being promoted as a more sustainable version of mining, but then it's also bringing air pollution and other problems to the local communities. And then at the end, you have your tailings, which is the toxic mine waste. And there's plenty of examples of tailing spills around the world, not all from lithium, but from other forms of mining that are going to be an issue or a threat here. So that's clay mining, and then finally there's now proposals to extract lithium from other types of brine. So instead of the desert brine that I was describing before, this method called direct lithium extraction is typically used for geothermal brines, where there's water very deep underground, where it's really hot because you're closer to the mantle and you're deeper into the surface. So there's a lot of heat coming from the insides of the earth. And because it's really hot, the water can dissolve more minerals from the rock there. And so this form of mining is being coupled with geothermal heat extraction or heat energy generation using geothermal heat. And the idea here is that you pump this hot, salty brine from deep underground. You use the heat to create electricity. Then you pass the water through some sort of filter system, and there's different kinds of technologies for how to do this. But you get the lithium ions out. In some cases, you swap them out for a different kind of ion. And so you get your lithium out, and then what you do with the leftover brine that still has other minerals and stuff in it is you put it back underground in some other location. And so this has not actually been done in the real world yet, and it's being really heavily promoted as, again, more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, because you're not drying out, you're not removing water from the system. But there are other impacts that aren't being, seriously considered as things that might affect people's health, like how introducing water that has been chemically altered back into the system can change what kinds of metals and minerals are being exposed to people that they're going to be breathing in and affecting their health. It's also, because this is done in places that have geothermal waters and sort of geologic activity, is this going to lubricate faults and make them more susceptible to earthquakes? There's questions like that that haven't really been addressed yet. And so, where lithium comes from, we've seen the Lithium Triangle, so-called Lithium Triangle in the Andes. There's lithium that's being pursued in Serbia. There's also lithium that comes from Australia. It's one of the biggest lithium producing countries currently. And right now, the closest sort of area to us who are presenting today is across a lot of the Western so-called United States. So Nevada, California, Arizona, Utah. This is a visualization of many of the lithium projects that are being explored and pursued in the Western states. This is coming from Desert Fog. And so there's a lot. And so to walk through a few of them that we are more closely, in contact and involved with. Next slide. This one, towards the northern part of it, is in a ancient volcanic caldera called Pahimaha in the Paiute-Shoshone language. The lithium project is called Thacker Pass Lithium Mine. And it's a massacre site that is sacred to the Paiute-Shoshone people there, and who don't want to disturb the dead. And so there's another one in, next slide, in Arizona on Hualapai land. So the picture there is of a sacred spring called Hakamwe that has been used not just by the Hualapai, but by many of the indigenous groups across the sort of Southern California, Northern Arizona region, and is also part of a water system that sustains life in this whole river valley running down this corridor of Arizona. And the exploration drilling that was recently proposed for this project surrounds this spring, like on 3 sides. So there's a picture there of the environmental impact report for that exploration, the exploration phase for that project. And then the one closest to San Diego is in the Salton Sea, which is an area that is very low income, and so there's a lot of sort of vulnerable populations who already are suffering from a lot of environmental health effects of living near the Salton Sea. So this is a map of PM 2.5, which is like small particles in the air that can cause asthma and other, health impacts. And so, there's already a lot of health concerns in this area where there's proposed lithium mining via the geothermal brine ion exchange method, the last one that I talked about. So that's the sort of Western United States, and then the closest projects that I know of to you all over on the other side of the so-called US is the Piedmont Lithium Project, and possibly others in North Carolina. There's a spodumene deposit, so there's hard rock that contains lithium over there that is being explored for mining as well, and the agricultural community is really concerned about what that's going to do to the water system and their farms and their cropland over there. And so coming back to electric cars, like when we see these cars and these charging stations, what we don't see here, if you go to the next slide, is all of the minerals that are going into this electricity and energy storage. We've been talking about lithium, but also nickel, cobalt, and copper, and other metals and minerals that come from many parts of the world and have their own environmental, social, cultural harms that come with them. And so really these electric cars and this very technologically centered energy transition is a continuation of extractive capitalism, where mineral and metal resources are being taken from communities and lands for corporate profit and to sustain the unsustainable lifestyles of the West or the global North or whatever you want to call it. And so at the same time, there's this global resistance against lithium mining and mining for all these other metals and minerals that's emerging. So the sign that we saw earlier at the beginning of the talk, No Comemos Batería, that came from a protest, a highway blockade in Argentina in 2019. The center top picture is from a resistance camp at Pahimaha against the Thacker Pass lithium mine. The bottom left one, I think, is from Portugal, The one in the middle, again, Piedmont, and then the one on the right is against a mine in Serbia that would destroy a river and cropland and pastures and really ancient like cultural heritage sites as well. And so I'll pass it on to Amrah now to talk about how we are intending to intervene as a collective and in our sort of research spheres, as well as organizers and activists looking to connect and support these struggles.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm just going to briefly say that I've been having a lot of trouble with the internet staying connected through the whole talk. So if I do disappear, my apologies. Or if it cuts out a lot, I'm not sure what's going on with my internet right now. But yes, we wanted to, CIEJ is a research collective. What we do is we provide research analysis. We do a lot of work to assist in a material way frontline communities dealing with extraction, primarily indigenous communities throughout the world who are dealing with the impacts of colonialism and extraction. And we also engage in a lot of community organizing and, connecting with people to talk about these issues as well. But when we work with communities, a lot of times what they ask is for concrete research because in so many of our fields, we're trained as academics to research on behalf of industry, on behalf of capital, on behalf of products, and not on behalf of our communities. And so that's sort of our focus as CIEJ, is to provide a space for us to do that research in a good way. And so this is just an example of one of our newest publications. It's a collaboration with the AI Institute, AI Now Institute, the Artificial Intelligence Institute at New York University. And we publish a critique of the ways that the COVID-19 pandemic has been used to deepen water extraction, colonialism, and inequity. And so the report advocates for water justice as a framework for community planning, engineering, artificial intelligence, policy, and social justice. And we've contributed 2 chapters to that report. And our chapters are actually the beginning of the report and the end. We kind of sandwich the other stories. And so we start off with giving a case study to some of the locations that Jessica was just telling you about, the indigenous communities in the Southwest who are being impacted by lithium mining and how that ties to a larger history of genocide from the gold rush that these same communities have experienced. So that was an article that I wrote, drawing on our work with CIEJ though, so it's very much, I feel like a collective report. And really what we're looking at is how, lithium mining is going to dump a lot of toxins on these communities and how it's really going to negatively impact, some of the most remote and some of the most marginalized indigenous communities in the country, areas where people, have already very little access to water and other resources. And then we also have a collective piece by all of us in CIEJ, which is called A Challenge to Green New Deal Activists. This is something we've been working on for a long time, and it comes out of our organizing and talking to folks about why there is such a demand from environmental activists for these false climate solutions, such as electronic vehicles. And we're really trying to debunk that what's actually happening, as Leslie was talking about with the marketing, is that activists are being encouraged to ask for things that benefit corporations and not people. And so we really wanted to counter some of the logics of the Green New Deal, especially to get people to think about that process. And so we really reject quote unquote sustainable technologies that actually reproduce gold rush devastation on indigenous peoples. And that's kind of what I'll dig into now. So we can go to the next slide. So these are our provocations to people who are engaged in the conversation around the Green New Deal. So for us in CIEJ, instead of demanding a Green New Deal, we actually make a call to Decolonize4Climate instead. And we think that that is the dialogue we need to be having now. We've put together a series of 10 principles for you to consider. 5 of them are things to move away from, and 5 of them are things to move towards. And we wanted to have that moving towards to give people a sense of hope and action, and that there are things we can do. Because, the issue of the climate feels very overwhelming and pessimistic for so many of us, but we really think that if we organize together, there's a lot that we can do. So we're going to go through them briefly, and we will, Leslie, maybe can you post a link in the chat? And then that way folks don't have to remember them, and you can, come back to them later and go to the next
Definitely,
slide as
yes.
well.
I'll ask Jessica to do that
Thank
because
you.
I can't.
Okay, thanks. So the first is don't reduce the problem to temperature and carbon. Simplistic carbon reduction solutions fail to deconstruct and heal the abusive relationship we have with the earth. And that's really colonial and capitalist extraction driven. So an exclusive focus on carbon and temperature as the only problems to mitigate when we're talking about climate change really comes from a decontextualized reliance on the IPCC report and some of these international measurements and statistics that folks are using in climate science and policy. But that sidelines the historical, dynamical, and cultural roots of climate change. It fails to address the oppressive system that perpetuates not only climate change, but also related destructive problems like contamination, extinction crises, water wars, etc. So what we argue is that we need to move from decarbonizing to decolonizing. And that's really the framework that gets at all of the issues together on why climate change could be so devastating for frontline communities. Next slide. So what do we mean by decolonization? It includes not only exposing the ongoing racist imperial apparatus, but breaking down the foundations of the nation state that maintains imperial, colonial, and extractive relations over people and resources. So we can think about the intersections of borders, prisons, the military, which is a huge polluter, and also the biggest consumer of lithium that people don't know. And it means taking back the land and waters that have been stolen from the original peoples for the profit of others. That's really what colonialism is about. And so what we want to argue for is that everyone should be involved, what we say do, decolonize, and rematriate everywhere as a framework of our movements. So what we mean by rematriation is to nurture a sacred relationship among the original caretakers of the lands, which is Indigenous people, through non-patriarchal roles and leadership. And to defend autonomy is to honor those people who still live and thrive in their ancestral territories and who continue to defend their autonomy in the face of encroaching theft, like the people that we talked about in the very beginning, the Indigenous sacred land protectors who are literally risking their lives to stop some of these mining and some of these destructive activities. And so we echo the call for land back. Slide. So then we go back to what not to do. Don't confuse radical with large scale. This is a problem we see in policy and activism all the time. So changing the energy source or production technology does not change the fundamental cause of climate change, which is energy and material consumption, colonialism, and capitalism. If we leave the roots of overconsumption in place, any superficial solution, even at a large scale, is still going to allow overconsumption and extractivism practices to morph with unknown ecological effects. So we agree that we need radical change, but by that we mean tearing out the colonial capitalist foundations of climate change via land back and abolition. Next slide. So do abolish the conditions that create energy demand. That's one of our biggest arguments, is instead of finding another source of energy, we need to look at why do we need so much energy in the first place, and what are we doing with this energy that comes at such a high ecological cost? So we're not just addicted to fossil fuels, we're addicted to energy. And so moving from fossil fuels to supposedly green technology isn't going to transform that relationship. It's actually just going to increase our demand to energy. And what we're going to keep getting into is this endless spiral where we're just going to exhaust the resources of the earth. And so what we think through is abolition as a framework. And abolition causes us to abolish the conditions, social, economic, and cultural, through which harm occurs. particularly, coming from a Black freedom tradition, looking at anti-Black harm, but also anti-Indigenous and genocide and how those are connected. So what we need to do is identify and challenge the conditions that structure energy use for itself and build new social discourses that shift away from energy demands towards equitable energy relations. Because that's where, if we look at our histories, of our histories of genocide, of enslavement, of colonialism, they come back to this common problem of consumption and energy and accumulation. And so abolition really gets us to look at those relationships. Next slide. So don't use extraction as a solution to extraction. This one is pretty simple. We want folks to be aware of analyses that criticize only one resource, like just only talking about fossil fuels in order to justify the exploitation of another resource, such as lithium, in the form of moving from a fossil fuel vehicle to an electronic vehicle. And this is what we're seeing. So extraction is a problem because it creates pollution and destroys the environment. And what we mean by extraction is the mining and the production of these materials, right? And there's no such thing as a clean mine, a clean factory, a clean plantation. These are kind of oxymoronic. So the real climate solution is actually reducing the accumulation and consumption that drives the need for factories and mines and plantations. Next slide. So do cultivate local systems of interdependence. Interdependence is how we can recognize and meet the needs of everyone else, especially queer, trans, and disabled folks that are marginalized within capitalism and colonialism. It's a way to realize that the consequences of extractive behavior. So we quote Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson, because we like how she kind of phrases this. If you're focused to stay in your 50-mile radius, then you're very much going to experience the impacts of extractivist behavior. And so we want people to think about, what are our local relationships? How can we really think about reducing our energy consumption from extracting at a global scale to making our needs as local as possible. Oh, baby.
You're not in the
Hi,
phone.
son. No, I'm not.
You're
Hi.
in the computer.
I'm in the computer.
Can you hold this?
Okay.
Can you
So the
I
next
can go
slide
ahead
is,
for the
don't
next
let
slide.
today's
can you open it?
I'll
Yes,
go
let
for
me
it.
handle
Yes.
this little one.
Yes.
Can you open
Our youngest member of CIEJ made their auditory appearance, which is fantastic. So for this next principle is, don't let today's demands make tomorrow's justice impossible. We don't want to postpone and continue to postpone real climate solutions. What we're saying is decolonization, by substituting a temporary one today. So we're really thinking about how policy and advocacy goals continue to accommodate capitalism and all these structures of extraction that we've been talking about. So we're focusing on not just structuring resistance around capitulating to the powers from above, but instead really thinking about how can we make power from below, right? From our local belows, the many belows that exist in different geographies, so that we can go beyond consumerism and beyond work and beyond the state. So we're asking, of each other and of ourselves how we can work in our everyday life that is not contradictory to a decolonial and abolitionist future. And I think that's a big, kind of ask of all of us to do in our everyday living, right? When we wake up to when we go to sleep. But it really does start in those relationships that we have to the lands and to the waters in our everyday, to start asking of ourselves, how is this furthering decolonization?
Beautiful. I can take the next one. So thinking about the everyday life, we really want to push people to think about transforming what labor means. And part of this comes from our experience as organizers, always seeing labor and environment pitted against each other in terms of policy. But also, it's really depressing to think about these big movements that we've been inspired by, such as civil rights and abolition and racial justice, being reduced to just a demand for a job, when at its core, having a job and being alienated from the land is fundamentally violent and dehumanizing in so many ways. So what we want to do is really ask us to think about, what could labor be otherwise? If it's not structured through capitalism, through extraction, through the systems that operated our workplaces, such as ableism, sexism, racism, we kind of argue that jobs should be abolished. No one really wants a job when we think about liberation. It's not the liberatory future that we imagine. We might think about work. We might think about collaboration. We might think about responsibility. We might think about creativity, things that we want to do, but having a job isn't really liberatory. And so we want to push back and get the labor movement to think about, maybe the question should be not seizing the means of production and making us, even more interpolated into the extractive process. Do we really, is liberation seizing the factory or seizing the mine, or is it abolishing the factory or abolishing the mine and our need for it? So we're thinking about this larger question that is, should jobs themselves be abolished? And that's part of our abolitionist decolonial framework. And if we connect decolonization to abolition, this is something that really becomes apparent. Decolonization requires us to abolish jobs and reimagine dignified labor as individual and collective efforts and activities beyond extraction, beyond profit and benefit, beyond inclusion, beyond work, beyond exclusion. So instead of jobs, we want a relationship with our tools and the environment that is convivial. And we draw that term from Ivan Illich. He has a book that came out in the 60s or 70s called Tools for Conviviality, where he started to ask these questions. And so we found that critique that has been taken up by Indigenous communities, particularly in Latin America, very provocative, and one that we should think about a lot more here in the global north. Next slide is, don't displace the impacts onto others. So this is another problem that we see in local organizing and statewide organizing, particularly. Some of the demands that communities are making to protect themselves at the local level require extraction at the global level. Might require solar panels that depend on enslavement of Black children in the in the DR, and in the Congo. And so, do we really want to tie, our local environmental protection to something that is furthering enslavement and abuse of children in the land in Africa? No, that's not a solution in the long term, right? So we see this as a problem where local work tends to center frontline communities here at the expense of frontline communities elsewhere. And so just like fossil fuels, our consumption of green technologies really negatively impacts communities of concern down the supply chain. And so what we want to move towards is, instead of an ethos of protecting the world together, protecting the earth together, what does that look like between the local and the global? How can we build those relationships? And it really requires a form of global accountability and resistance to the greenwashing of these false climate solutions, such as lithium batteries. And we have a little catchphrase for this that we'd like to think about, which is, selective protection means collective oppression. Next slide. And this is our last point here. We do want folks to be accountable to our local and global interconnectedness. So the Green New Deal focuses on US policies and the associated transitions in the US labor, technological, and economic sectors will impact the rest of the world. So climate change resistance strategies have to go beyond the nation state and beyond local policies in many ways, and limit the critique that we hear from around the world of our solutions always being US-centric, always benefiting those in the global north to the detriment of those in the global south. And so what we want to really move towards is being much more inclusive of transnational and trans-territorial communities in our organizing. and thinking about the solutions and things that we demand. Greenwashing really obscures how US imperialism, for example, continues to wage violence in pursuit of mineral resources around the world. So organizing for environmental justice has to be connected to anti-war organizing, to anti-imperial organizing, has to be connected to building accountable relationships for what the US represents globally. And so what we want to push folks towards in environmental organizing is to really think about these global patterns of ecocide and dehumanization that manifest through extraction, and how we need to transform the boundaries of what the environment means and extend our local consciousness to a global interconnectedness. And so that's why we do a lot of the work that we do, trying to connect with communities, trying to have meetings where we're talking to folks in Indigenous communities in South America, in, people in Serbia resisting lithium mines there. We're really interested in fostering these relationships because at the heart of it, we're all on the same planet together. And this is the framework we really need to think about. And so if you go to the next slide, we have more provocations for doing this work that you can use as conversation starters. You can talk about with your own organizations, with your friends, your family. We have comics, we have infographics, we have a lot of different materials, videos on our website. And that's really how we want the information to be used. We like to take a lot of these complex scientific problems and break them down in a way that you can talk about them and think through them yourself, and really start to have conversations with the people in your life about how do you get involved, how do you make these shifts, what can you do, what are relationships that you can build. And let's see, our last slide here, we've got a couple more. So we are kind of making a call to action, and this is part of why we use the hashtag Decolonize4Climate. We have provocations on our social media to think about using social media in ways that can build this movement. But we also are really pushing for, some radical ways of addressing climate change that include drastically divesting from colonial life. We have a strong critique of greenwashing, even when it masquerades as politically progressive. And we are really centering respect for and solidarity, meaningful material solidarity with Indigenous communities, creating reciprocal relationships with frontline Indigenous communities. And we're calling for research action through a research justice framework. So we have some information on our website about what research justice means for those of you who are students, who are maybe seeing yourself going into different realms of research. What can you do as a researcher to be of service to this movement, to be of use towards protecting the planet, protecting sacred land and life? And we're also thinking about the question of culture and pop culture, and how can we collectively move towards an anti-extractivist cultural framework? How can we popularize that so that that becomes our norm instead of just consuming more products that make the problem worse? And we are excited to meet folks who are on the call here and to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I know you can't see all of almost 100 people on the call clapping for you. So this is me just saying thank you. Just in general, I'm always in awe and I always learn something new. So I think everything that you all put forward is a lot of food for thought for folks. I'm going to hand it over to Carla for our Q&A. And I encourage folks to use the Q&A or chat function to put their questions up.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you again. This was so enriching. So the first question is by Alex. I'm wondering what role nuclear power plays in an intersectionalist green framework, if at all, and if not at all, why so? Thanks.
The short The short answer is nuclear power requires a tremendous amount of energy in order to produce energy. So it's extractive in and of itself. And then once, and that's one of the problems with the electric car, for example, is, the individual car might reduce emissions, but that car, once it's plugged in, is connected to a whole electrical grid. And that electrical grid is still oftentimes dependent on fossil fuels, on coal plants, is still producing a lot of pollution, a lot of carbon. So nuclear functions in a similar way, and maybe Jessica and Leslie, you want to tackle this more, but if you look at how much energy it takes to produce nuclear energy, and then what are the byproducts, what is the waste of that nuclear energy, in a bigger scale of production, it's just not a solution. It actually causes more harm. It's more extractive than it's worth.
Yeah, I think nuclear is kind of an attractive like alternative for people to bring up. But I wasn't even thinking first of like the sort of energy use calculations because those can get very tricky for any technology that you look at. It all depends on like what kind of grid you're connected to and like how you're using it and all these like details. But just thinking about where the like where we get uranium from and like who's living there and who's suffering those impacts and all of those questions, it overlaps, very similarly to the same problems that we've been talking about here of like you're unearthing these materials on lands whose people did not consent to, being exposed to these like, toxic um, like substances and then leaving the waste there for them to deal with. And so I think from that perspective, if you're thinking of it from like an intersectional, feminist, sustainable sort of framework, like I don't think it checks any of those boxes. So, Leslie, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, that's great. I think the point is energy for what, right? Like even whatever folks want to name as the source, right? Whether it's nuclear, hydrogen, or lithium, or anything, for what? And I think that's the main question that we have for all of us to answer. And then I think that'll get us to the alternatives that folks are looking for that actually don't depend on extraction at all.
I think that Leslie just answered the next question, but I'm gonna make it in case you want to add something. Are there any ethical alternatives to copper lithium extraction?
Yes, decolonization. Yes, that's the alternative.
I think that's the same answer to the next question, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So, is solar power the same level as fossil in process or better than fossil? It's like,
So, there's a lot of work that's been done on solar panels. And it goes back to what Jessica was saying. Solar panels require minerals that are very rare, that are located in some of, the most vulnerable places of the world. And also play, not only in terms of histories of colonialism and racism, right? And that's what we mean by vulnerable place. Where has there just been a history of very violent genocide, colonialism, racism, and the people who are indigenous to that place are extremely marginalized in the global system, but also where that history of genocide and colonialism has also been paired with ecocide. And so the non-human beings that they live with, the plants, the animals, the microbes, all of the things that are in their environment have been also impacted in a very violent way that has much more of an impact on global warming and climate change. If you think about problems of deforestation, um, if you think about, not just forests, but also the ocean as a place of carbon, cycling, the microbes in the soil, all of as processing, breaking down, methane and other gases. So this when you think about the interconnectedness of these places, is it worth it for a solar panel that has a finite lifetime, right? And then what do we do with that material once the solar panel has kind of run its course of use? They're only good for a certain amount of years. They don't last forever. And so these are questions that that's why we go back to decolonization as a question. Nobody asked the community there. No one asked the people whose land is being mined for solar panels what their answer to this question is. And that's where we kind of need to start.
If you are interested in more of like the details about solar panels, that's something that we haven't really delved into super deeply as a collective, but there's a book called, I think it's called Solar Power by Dustin Mulvaney, who that goes into some of those like some of the issues with like extraction and I think also the end of use issues with solar panels as well. So if you're interested in learning more about that. And then I think like going back to the question about ethical alternatives, I mean, I know it's frustrating to be like, okay, well, I need something to, I need to like have some sort of alternative to hold on to. But it's like I think all of the things that that we think of first are still within this sort of same extractive framework, even things of like, is there a better way to mine lithium? Is there a better way to mine copper? Can we improve these mining strategies? And even things like sustainable certification certificates and green mining programs and things like that. Like because they're still embedded in this capital colonial extractive system, like they just sort of end up facilitating that and like even lowering the standards of like quality of environmental protection and like community protection and stuff. And so it's really hard to break out of that a sort of mindset, but it's a challenge for all of us to sort of let go of that need for like um, immediate solution right now and think bigger and think beyond that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answers. There are many questions about this idea of transforming the idea of labor. The first one is, how do you suggest reworking one's own framework on labor/work in a way that doesn't center capital? I'm having trouble wrapping my head around it. Thanks.
So part of it is in thinking about, on the one hand, where so many of us are in precarious situations where we have to work in order to survive, right? And so there are different points at which we can map through what do we need? That question, what do we need to survive? What do we need to not just survive, but live lives of joy and empowerment and security and connection with others, where we can think about how can we de-link those things from capitalism? How can we de-link them from extraction? Are there creative solutions to fill any of those needs that we can de-link from colonialist extraction? And that's the question. And that's where a lot of communities come up with these very beautiful, very creative solutions around the world. And we're always going to be, I think, in a process of learning and failing and innovating with this because jobs have been so much of our reality for the last, couple hundred years that we've been dealing with this colonialist enterprise. But in the long-term scheme of human life and history, it's very new. And so it means it can be undone. And to keep that historical perspective, I think, is useful. And to look at possibly, other alternatives that we've had in the past that we don't know much about. The past often gets maligned as if it was not that great, and the present is supposed to be the best moment, but oftentimes the present is problematic, and the past sometimes had moments of greatness. So I think I would push folks to think about that. And to think about, the ways that we internalize these logics of work, how many of us feel guilty when we're not productive, right? Like how many of us feel like instead of spending an evening enjoying the company of our friends and loved ones, or, going to a cultural event or sharing a meal, we should be working or we should be doing something, and just decolonizing ourselves from that logic as much as we can. But in terms of what we ask for when we make demands on power as well, and thinking about how can we don't want to say that there's no use for addressing discrimination at work. There's no use for addressing violence at work, for, organizing against a oppressive boss. Those things still have value in the short term, but in the long term, what are we locking ourselves into? If that's the limit of our imagination, we have to still think beyond that, and delinking from extraction and capitalism as much as we can. And a lot of that requires collectivizing and valuing each other for just being, instead of valuing each other for our value under capitalism, our value to produce. So that we really think about kind of tying this question of transforming labor also to a radical disability framework, and think about the body as something that is of inherent value by itself without needing to produce or to create value.
That was awesome, Amrah. And I also wanted to tie it back to what you were saying when we had this point in the do's and don'ts part of the talk, where jobs, labor, and environmentalism seem often at odds because jobs are inherently extractive. And we really wanted to have this point when we put together our reflections on climate activism, because the way that the climate movement has tried to link jobs and environment together and make them work together in for climate justice and action and everything, is to say everybody needs good green jobs. Like everyone who's in the fossil fuel industry right now should be retrained and be able to work in the green energy sector. And that's the limit of this idea of labor being part of the climate and environmental movement, and it seems so limited in scope and imagination. And so that's sort of where we were coming from, and why we wanted to expand that to all of the ideas that Amrah just talked about here, of questioning the need for a job to sustain ourselves as living beings in the first place. So just for some context.
I want to add just a couple of things that both Jessica and Amrah brought up, in the fact that there are already examples of what it looks like to delink labor from capitalism, from either the past or in the present moment. Even if we think about all the mutual aid projects that have spurred up, across geographies because of pandemic or even before pandemic, and what it means to care and to center care amongst people, amongst your block, amongst your neighbors, amongst a geography where you're actually dependent on someone's backyard for lettuce or for fruits, because you can't go to the grocery store and pay because you don't have a job right now because there's a pandemic. So there's already multiple ways that folks have been able to center survivance and to center care for the person that lives right next to you, or that person that lives, in your same house, that doesn't have to be mediated by capitalism or by a job, but literally because there's land where people have, planted fruits instead of grass. Now folks can eat something. So I think thinking about those projects and expanding them, but also making them as the way of life instead of just a temporary moment or a localized solution is really important. And I think we have many of those examples, thinking about the Black Panther Party, right? Thinking about Zapatistas, thinking about the multiple ways that we have been taught how to live otherwise that doesn't center a mediation of capitalism in our relationships of the everyday, right? The everyday care. What can that look like, and not have it be like a transactional, well, I'm getting paid to babysit, instead of, well, I actually care for my friend's child, so I'm gonna give my hours to that love and to that care. I think it's important to think about that, right? Yeah, just wanted to say those.
And just a last note on disability too is that we've had a lot of internal conversations about why we use the framework of tools for conviviality. And part of that is that it goes along with the disability justice framework very well. You know, a single person driving in their car, you know, commuting 3 hours round trip to a shitty job every day is not convivial, but a wheelchair is convivial, you know, even an electric wheelchair. You know, so we're not saying, you know, that we need to abolish all of the technologies that, for example, make a disabled person's life more accessible, but that the overconsumption of energy that we don't need, that's just fueling the interests of capital, is a problem, right? And so that's the distinction that we're making. And so we kind of center ourselves in a solidarity with radical disability justice, in that sense of always pushing for thinking about how can a tool, how can technology, how can innovation actually be convivial towards delinking from colonialism, towards uplifting disabled people, instead of how can it just be extractive and consumerist.
Yeah. And on a similar note, because I saw there was a question specifically about disability justice in the chat, so it's worth spending some time on it. Like, lithium is also used to make mood stabilizing like drugs, right? So and we haven't had a lot of deep discussions about that yet, to sort of figure out exactly like our like nuanced analysis of that. But in general, it's right about the overconsumption, about the extraction, about the scale, about the like what is it for question that Leslie kept bringing up, and emphasizing, and all of the, you know, the sort of really big picture, like structural, convivial, collective, like interdependent sort of future that we want to promote is also, I think, very much compatible with a like a world that's much more livable for all of us, including disabled folks. So I think that they very much like go together.
Thank you very much. There's a question about if there are any potential ways to recycle the lithium ions we've already mined.
There are, I don't know if I have a great answer to this, but there are some. It's definitely a big topic of research. There's another member of CIEJ who, at her institution that she was at previously, there was like a whole big like group of like network of people who are working on recycling lithium and other minerals. I think like, and that's this idea of like a circular economy is something that some um, organizations that are working in sort of mining resistance talk about sometimes, of like thinking about the whole life cycle and like how can we reuse things. But I think it's still, I mean, regardless of whether or not you are able to recover minerals from like products that have already been produced, like we still have this necessity, and this requirement of seriously like adjusting and cutting back on like how much we're using and all these things. And I think if that is going to be part of the picture, it also comes down to like product design, which I think goes back into the whole idea of like what are we using this for? Like if like it's not, these products are not designed to be recyclable and to have their parts be recovered, and it would I don't know what things would look like if they were, but it's something that would have to be like built in from the very beginning.
Thank you so much. This next question asks, if one's not Indigenous, how can they be a good ally to this topic and effort?
Anyone want to take that? I don't know.
I was hoping you or Leslie would answer.
I was gonna say you too.
We
No,
can,
this is a good question. I think from where we stand in terms of, thinking about our positionalities, localities, geographies, we really take a lot of influence and inspiration from the Zapatistas who, in indigenous territories, Chiapas, in Mexico, tell us that it's important for us to do the work where we're at, wherever we're at. And whoever is in relationship to us in that time, in that space, in that calendar, it's important to make a new type of relationship that isn't mediated by these systems of oppression. So it's important for us to build relationships, no matter with who, no matter the where, no matter the how, no matter the when, because these are the only ways that we can combat a globalized system together is through deep relationships. And what that needs to look like, it'll not be, answered in a diversity and inclusion workshop. It will not be through inclusionary, structural, institutionalized practices. It's going to look like remaking and reweaving our social fabric that destroys systems of oppression, even when we're trying to relate to each other. So, if we're thinking about destroying white supremacy, destroying patriarchy, heteronormativity, and all these different ways that we continue to really do a lot of violence on each other, we have to answer, well, how can we instead care, right? Going back to that care work, where we're not necessarily just allies, but in something that Indigenous Action and Quintanilla has written about in terms of how can we be accomplices to each other's struggles, and how can we work and organize in joint struggle from our positionalities, from wherever our histories and kind of histories of multiple types of oppression, how can they also be a part of relating to somebody else's? So whether we identify or not with another person or community's movement or histories, it's important to be in relation to, coming from our places, our times, our stories. So I would say, don't be afraid. So forever that's that question, don't be afraid to be in joint struggle with somebody, because that's going to actually require you first to do a lot of self-reflection, a lot of deep work, in order for you to then come into relation and space and love and care with somebody else who is hopefully doing that same thing simultaneously. And that's a big part of the, not just, materialist, way of combating all these systems of oppression, but it's also very spiritual. It's also very much internal. It's also very, very metaphysical, and it could also be ancestral. And that's, part of the things that isn't understood in the current colonial way that we live. So it's deep, right? It's deep.
Yeah, I feel like this is something that I think about a lot as like somebody who's not indigenous to this land. Like my roots are in Taiwan and in China, and so I actually do understand like my family history as part of the like colonial history of the United States in many different ways, in terms of like military presence in Taiwan, in terms of like, the gold rush in the 1800s. That was like sort of a big, diaspora from China, and like, who was here beforehand, and all of these things. And so I think that coming in with some sort of like self-awareness and like humility is really important, if whenever you're coming into some sort of joint struggle with somebody who is where you're not like of there, and you have some like a different, maybe more removed relationship to whatever it is that they're fighting for, that you're fighting with them for. because there's, you know, a lot of ways that folks have criticized people who claim to be allies or even accomplices to Indigenous struggles. And so I feel like the, you know, constant self-reflection um, and you know, coming in with good intentions, but also always thinking critically about how you are actually interacting with the space and the people and the land and everything is always part of it. And then just being kind of like consistent and reliable, like, and showing that you are actually there for people and not just gonna like show up once and then never show up again, which is not just for being an ally to Indigenous folks and movements, but to any sort of space that you're trying to support.
This is why I love working with you all. But I think the last thing I would say, as you know, I do identify as Indigenous as from my homelands here in the what is now called Arizona and northern Mexico. What I notice, like, because I grew up in an urban location, you know, I grew up in Northern California away from where my grandparents were from and where our community is from. And I was involved in urban kind of people of color organizing, you know, because we're a border tribe. I was also identify as Chicana and I was involved in a lot of Latinx organizing. What I notice is that there's just this complicity with erasure that happens a lot where when people are meeting to talk about what to do locally, they don't include the Indigenous people of the place. You know, they never, and it's that idea that we just can't form those relationships, or that we don't even recognize that people still exist and might still live nearby and might actually have a lot of things to say about this particular problem and want to be involved in it. And so that's part of the provocation I would give folks is, especially if you're in an urban location, to not forget and not be complicit when other people in the room are acting as if Indigenous people don't exist there anymore and have not invited them to be part of the space. To question that loudly always, and not in a tokenizing way either. You know, not don't ask folks to just come and, you know, do an opening prayer. Don't ask folks to just, unless you're going to do the hard work of sitting with spiritual land-based questions for the entire length of the event, then that would be appropriate. But as a tokenizing gesture, don't do it. But have the courage to form these relationships, as Leslie and Jessica were saying, you know, have the courage to call people, invite them, and sit down and listen and work together. You know, don't be complicit with that erasure.
And I know we're just out of time, so I want to say thank you all so much for inviting us to this space, and thank you all for being logged in. All the participants, thank you for choosing to be here with us.
Thank you so much to you, Leslie, to Amrah, to Jessica, for all the work that y'all are doing, for really proposing the hard work that decolonization actually means. Like, in practicality, it's a lifelong undoing of everything we've been taught, of really thinking locally, of like actual radical solutions, like an everyday, like you wake up and every day it's an intentional choice that you make. Not at all easy, right? We're all in the process. So it's just great to remind us of that, or to kind of begin that conversation for folks that are just beginning this conversation, and to understand how this links to all of these other things, right? Like climate justice, it's tied to everything else. So I really, really appreciate it. I thank you all. I respect you. I look up to you. Y'all are awesome. And UMBC is really lucky to have had an hour and a half of all of your knowledge. So thank you all so much. And thank you folks for coming in. I'm going to quickly on the chat put the link for the Dresser Center YouTube channel in case folks are interested in catching the talk or parts that you missed. That's where you can find it shortly uploaded. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to all my co-hosts. Y'all are amazing.
Thank you. It was so great meeting you, and I learned so much. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Thank you,
I'm
everyone.
gonna stop the recorder now.
Thanks,
Yes.
everyone.